Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Gopi Jana Balabha Girivara Dhari 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 Jasodanandana Brajajanarandana Jasodanandana Brajajanarandana Jamuna Tira Vanam Jadi Jamuna Tira Vanam Jadi Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Madhava Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Gopi Jana Balabha Girivara Dhari Girivara Dhari Gopi Jana Balabha Girivara Dhari Gopi Jana Balabha Girivara Dhari Jasodanandana Brajajanarandana Jasodanandana Brajajanarandana Jamuna Tira Vanam Jadi Jamuna Tira Vanam Jadi Tira Vanam Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Madhava Kunja Vihari Jayom Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivacharya Srimad His Divine Grace Sri Bhakti Vedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Grantharaj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Gora Premanandi. And I notice you have a Bhagavatam. It means you have a whole set. You very kindly had the section ready, but I'm going to be reading from my computer because there's commentary. Now, for the benefit of our two young fellows here, we've been discussing Brahma's prayers. You know who is Lord Brahma, right? Okay. Yes? Yep. What about you? Yes. Okay. And it comes right after the pastime of Brahma stealing the calves and cowherd boys, putting them in a cave, coming back to see what would happen. And there was the cowherd boys sitting having lunch. So he went back to the cave, and they were in the cave. What's going on? So he went back, and Krishna showed not only that he had manifested identical forms of each cowherd boy and each calf, but then he showed forms of Narayan at the same time, surrounded by all of the unlimited potencies of Narayan, each one of those forms, and the calves, same thing, and then that many universes. How do you see multiple universes? But Krishna was able to show that. And then Krishna withdrew all those features or expansions within himself in his original form. And Brahma offered his prayers to Krishna, the original form. So we've been hearing truths about Krishna. It's called Krishna Tattva. First of all, Krishna is the source of everything. That's an explanation of Vedanta Sutra. Bhagavatam is a commentary on Vedanta Sutra. What's Vedanta Sutra? It's little sutras or codes that have in a very packed up, compressed form the whole of the Vedas, which are very vast, but everything's there in those sutras. So the Bhagavatam is explaining them. And the first starting point, the first sutra, is what is it from which everything comes? And the answer is Krishna. Brahma's indicating everything comes from Krishna. So what's everything? He starts describing the avatars, starting with the forms of Vishnu avatars, the three of them. Vishnu that expands the universes, that's Mahavishnu. Vishnu that enters into each universe, that's Garbhodaksha Vishnu. And then that Garbhodaksha Vishnu enters into every atom and every soul within the universe, and that's Paramatma or Kshirodaksha Vishnu. Three Vishnus. It's actually one entity, but differentiated according to function. So Krishna is the source of all those Vishnu forms. Then he's the source of the Guna avatars. People outside of India think that in India people believe there's three features of God, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. But actually they're expansions of Krishna. That's what's described by Brahma. And so there's Purusha avatars, Guna avatars, Guna in charge of the modes, Guna avatars, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Leela avatars, sometimes empowered, Shakti Avesh avatars, and those are, in Krishna's the avatari. He's the source of all avatars. Then after discussing that topic in the form of prayers, he then starts speaking about Krishna as the source of all Shakti, or potency. And so there's spiritual material potency. The universes are material potency. And the bodies of living entities within those universes are material energy. And then within the material energy, there's a spirit soul. And so now comes the topic of, well, on the one hand, liberation. That's what we're discussing this evening. On this side over here is liberation, and over on that side is the misery of material existence, or stuck in the illusion of misidentifying that which is temporary, misidentifying with the temporary. Excuse me, that which is not temporary, identifying with the temporary, the eternal soul. So we heard the other day, I guess it was yesterday, Sanatan Goswami giving us kind of like a hierarchy of knowledge of the soul, knowledge of Paramatma, knowledge of Bhagavan, knowledge of the original source of everything, Swayam Bhagavan Krishna. And it's different renderings of the verse grammatically correct renderings of what Brahma is saying. And what Brahma is saying is, if you have knowledge of that which is eternal, if your intelligence and mind are fixed on Atma, that's the individual soul, then you're liberated. Or if you fix your mind on Paramatma, the living entity is a subset of Parama, or a tiny fragmental part of Vishnu, so then you're also liberated, and so forth. So what's illusion? Illusion is the covering. It's not just the covering, it's the misidentification with the covering. Thinking that's it. Like the body is me, and this universe, that's it, and there's nothing beyond this universe. So we're going to hear a couple of Sanskrit terms that connect to that. So we're beginning now, 10:14:26. And here's the translation. The conception of material bondage, this is, we're talking about liberation. The conception of material bondage and the conception of liberation are both manifestations of ignorance. The conception. Being outside the scope of true knowledge, that's material bondage and liberation, cease to exist when one correctly understands that the pure spirit soul is distinct from matter and always fully conscious. So bondage is the misidentification. Liberation is just the negation of the bondage. But what the point is, same point as what was discussed previously. If the faculty of awareness or consciousness goes to that which is eternal, there's no meaning to bondage, there's no meaning to liberation, because as far as the soul is concerned, there's no covering over the soul. The soul is pure. And then it gives a little example. The example is, from the perspective of the sun, there's no day and night. Night being dismissed means day, but if from the perspective of the sun, there's no day and there's no night. They have no meaning. It's just luminous. At that time, what's that? When consciousness is fixed on the soul or the Supreme Soul, at that time, bondage and liberation no longer have any significance, just as day and night have no significance from the perspective of the sun. So the topic is, just stepping back, because it's going to get a little, language gets a little, what's he saying here? What's the relationship between Prakriti, or between Shakti, this creative, universe, and the living entity? What's the relation? And it's bewildering if one thinks that's it. And if one understands that's not it, I'm the soul, the place of pure consciousness, that's who I am, then bondage and liberation have no more meaning than day and night from the perspective of the sun. So this is the BBT. I say BBT because the last chapter that Prabhupada translated was chapter 13. This is just the beginning of his disciples translating. So BBT, material bondage is illusion, because the living entity actually has no real relationship with the material world. Because of false ego, the conditioned soul identifies himself with matter. Therefore, the so-called liberation is simply the giving up of an illusion, rather than release from actual bondage. There's no actual bondage from the soul's perspective, any more than there's day and night from the sun's perspective. There's no bondage because it has nothing to do with material energy. The illusion has everything to do with the soul, and that's the misidentification part. And with misidentification, then there's a potency in Prakriti, material nature, that bewilders. That's what Maya is. The bewildering influence. There's nothing inherently good or bad with the universe or any object. It's not inherently good or bad. How you regard it, like Prabhupada's example is a scalpel, a knife. Now, it can be a weapon or it can be a surgical instrument. The knife isn't good or bad. It's the consciousness of the person holding the knife and how they use it, skilled or not. However, even if we think that the suffering of material illusion is real and that liberation is thus a meaningful release from suffering, the mere absence of material existence is still insignificant compared to the achievement of factual spiritual life, which is the positive eternal reality. As opposed to the negative illusion of material life. I spent some time this afternoon considering what I was going to speak about Saturday evening, so I'll share with you ahead of time, sneak preview, Saturday evening. Have you ever read in Prabhupada's books where he writes, and then devotional service began, or then devotional service begins? And like, what does that mean? It's like, da 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 da, and then devotion. So what are we doing now? Are we doing devotional service? Or what is it if it's not devotional service? And that phrase comes from the term Brahma Bhuta, which is found in several places. One is in Bhagavad Gita, celebrated verse. Do you know any Bhagavad Gita verses? No. You know the Bhagavad Gita verse? Brahma Bhuta Prasannatma? Say. I've heard it. You've heard it. Brahma Bhuta, 1854. Brahma Bhuta Prasannatma na sochati na kanksati samak sarveshu bhuteshu. The last line, Mad Bhaktim Labate Param. Mad Bhaktim, my devotional service, Labate, obtains. Param. You know, his connection with Krishna is obtained, or bhakti is obtained, when all these conditions are met, which would indicate until then devotional service hasn't started. So Brahma Bhuta indicates the liberated stage. That's this discussion, where the soul no longer identifies with the covering, the soul identifies with who the soul really is, the seat of consciousness. That's who we really are. There's a covering, yes, and we're using the covering, yes, wisely, hopefully, and avoiding, using it foolishly. Use the scalpel in the surgical way, not in a murderous way. So, how this cosmic manifestation, how the body, how the senses are used, that's virtue, or versus vice. Theistic conduct versus sinful behavior. But The liberated position, Brahmabhuta stage, is the liberated position where attention doesn't just go to good and bad, right and wrong, and morality, or laws governing how to use this place, the material creation, laws given by God. But beyond that is the stage where the consciousness is focused upon who we really are and who is the supreme. That's the Brahmabhuta stage, self-realization. Beyond piety and impiety, it's self-realization. And there's symptoms that are mentioned. Prasanatma, a happiness. Prasanna atma, a happiness at the soul platform. Then two other characteristics. One, no hankering, no lamenting. That is, there's desire. The desire is I want to be connected with Krishna, but the material hankering and material lamentation finished. On the strength of that self-realization, on the strength of that spiritual happiness, material hankering, lamenting finished. And then a really nice third one, and that is seeing all living entities equally. I mean, you can differentiate from different types of bodies. This is a tiger, and I don't go embrace the tiger. Here's a nice kitty cat, and I go pet the kitty cat. So I make distinctions between one living entity and another. But I don't think of, I think of them as a spirit soul of all living entities. All living entities connected to the Supreme Soul. And then devotional service begins. That is pure devotional service. So what happens before pure devotional service? It's sadhana bhakti. That's what we're doing. So one perspective is we're doing bhakti, but it's practice. But it's a stage of bhakti, so it's bhakti. And another perspective, devotional service is pure, so all this is just practice to get us to the point where we become Brahmabhuta, or self-realized, beyond the bodily conception, beyond hankering, lamenting, all that stuff. Beyond discriminating against people and favoring other people and all that stuff. It's the party spirit and competition and wars and all that. One makes distinctions on the physical plane, but one doesn't identify that's the person. Whether it's a spider or, somebody from a different color or different gender or different culture or different political party. That's what's going on these days. There's differences. There's lots of differences, but there's samak sarveshu bhuteshu mad bhaktim labate param. So that statement, all of that is the factual achievement of spiritual life from the liberated position to engage in service to the Supreme Lord is far beyond liberation. That's the statement. It's insignificant. I'll read the sentence again. Even if we think that the suffering of material illusion is real, and that liberation is thus a meaningful release from suffering, the mere absence of material existence is insignificant compared to the achievement of factual spiritual life, which is the positive eternal reality, as opposed to the negative illusion of material life. Ultimately, Krishna consciousness, or pure love of Godhead, is the only significant, meaningful, and permanent status for every living entity. Paragraph. Then comes the example, the sun example. Since the darkness of night, that's like the misery of material existence, the darkness of night is caused by the absence of the sun, one would not experience night within the sun itself, nor would one experience individual days separated by nights. Similarly, within the pure living entity, there is no material darkness, and thus no experience of liberation from such darkness. When the conditioned soul comes to this platform of pure consciousness, he becomes fit to associate with the Supreme Pure, the Personality Godhead Himself, in the Lord's own abode, Mad Bhaktim Labhate Param. And then devotional service begins. Vishwanath Chakrabarti Thakur writes, in this verse, the fact that the acceptance of a false world also makes liberation false is made clear. The words bondage in the world and liberation from the world, these two opposites, which both arise from ignorance, cease when a person has true knowledge of the jiva, just as the day and night taken separately from the sun have no meaning, but when from the point of view of the sun, read it again. Just as the day and night taken separately from the sun have meaning, but when from the point of view of the sun they have no meaning. Jiva Goswami is a little longer. Within the verse there's the Sanskrit Rita Gya Bhavat. We're going to hear that again, which he translates as from a particular object, that's the soul, Atma, which is the knower of the permanent, himself, or the Supreme Soul. When that consciousness is restored, that's liberation. But it's more than liberation because the covering just doesn't exist anymore. Or consciousness, which is revealing like the sun. In this case, bhava and atma have a similar meaning, since bhava means that which reveals, or brings into existence, or brings to life. Atmani, in the present verse, like Atmanam in the previous verse, both refer to the jiva. So there's these two contrasting things, that which brings things into existence and the life force. Knowledge of jiva leads to liberation, and ignorance of jiva leads to bondage. Paragraph. Bondage and liberation are different from knowledge of Atma, since they are functions of Maya. Bondage and liberation are functions of Maya, and the soul is not conducted by that influence of Maya when the soul understands who the soul really is. It's just like here's a light bulb, and it's got some kind of frosty tint to the glass. Supposing, like these Christmas lights, supposing there's one that's red, supposing there's one that's green, supposing there's one that's blue, there's another one that's yellow. Doesn't change the filament inside. The filament is unchanged. There's a covering that's red, blue, green, yellow, whatever, but the light itself doesn't change. So supposing you remove the tint, the red, blue, green, doesn't change the filament inside. It is what it is. The soul is what it is. And so liberation is a question of withdrawing consciousness from illusion, instead focusing on who you really are. It's the process of self-realization. We discussed a little bit this morning. But self-realization without understanding where that self is in relation to the source of the self is incomplete. Self-realization without God-realization is incomplete. Just like your family here. If one of the family thinks, I'm independent, Well, you're not independent. You function together as unit. Without mom and dad, you two guys wouldn't be around. So we're there's minute independence. There's some freedom to this and that. I'll eat Wheaties instead of Cheerios or something. I'll eat oatmeal instead of something. Prabhupada gives the example, like, because morning walks, he would see people do what people do, walking their dogs on a leash. And so the person with the dog can't just go out without the master. He's got a leash. So when the master goes out, he's under the control of the master. And the master has a leash. But then at the same time, the master, if the dog wants to stop, the master stops. If the dog wants to pass urine, he stops while the dog passes urine. There's reciprocation from the master to the servant. But it's not there. So there's some freedom, and but it's a relationship that this is the master, that's the servant. So that's our position. Krishna is the master, we're the servant. We have some freedom. And if we identify with who we are, the soul having a supreme master, and we're acting in a relation with supreme master, that's a position of freedom. And then illusion, is far away when that consciousness is restored. The difficulty is getting there because we have some different ideas about what the degree of independence and what the purpose of objects out there is. They're for enjoyment. And that's not the servant-master relationship. Okay, so now finally, Sanatana Goswami, and we're done for this evening. Release from samsara has been stated to be insignificant. That was the previous. This verse explains that liberation is not the goal of life at all. From true knowledge, Rita Gya Bhavat, we mentioned that Sanskrit already. Rita Gya Bhavat, true knowledge. Bondage and liberation do not exist. Actually, the two are based on falsity. When one reflects on Atma, the eternal form of knowledge, which is pure and beyond matter, liberation becomes false. Like bondage was false. From the sun there is no light. For the sun there is no night. And by thinking that there is no night, there is no day. With no samsara, liberation becomes insignificant. Thus, it is not the goal of life. Or, another grammatical rendering of this, when one thinks only of the Supreme Lord in the mind, Kevale Pure Atmani, there is no bondage or liberation. Doubt. How can both bondage and liberation become false just by deliberation? By where the mind goes. They just stop. They don't exist. Answer, the Lord has condensed eternal knowledge. Ajastra Chitti. That's in the Sanskrit of this verse. By thinking of the Lord. That's what the mind does when it's doing its meditation. Knowledge about the truth of both bondage and liberation arises. It is like the sun in the day and night. By having no night, the division that creates day disappears. It's not so difficult. I mean, I suppose, a modern, acharya could make it simpler sounding. These acharyas, they're writing for people of their time. And people of their time are far more elevated, tuned into what the Vedas have to say, and refinements of those messages. In one sense, reading them makes it a little difficult. And what Prabhupada did is he took that very precise language of previous acharyas and made a smoothie out of it. Put it in with some sugar and turned it on high speed, and it came out like yummy. Real easy. For the most part. I mean, some things a little difficult. Stepping back, the message is, in simple terms, the essence, because it was from previous verses, the essence of the means of becoming free from bondage is bhakti. The essence of becoming free from bondage is not gyan. And gyanis will not understand these things because of the methodology that they're using. They're using their blunt instruments, senses, mind, and material intelligence, and it can only go so far. So what Brahma is expressing is what he's realized through bhakti. That is, engaging his senses, his mind, and his intelligence in service. That's bhakti yoga. And now he's better able to understand this whole idea of liberation is not really what the goal of the Vedas or the goal of life is. It's a negation of something, but it's not a positive experience of who we really are. We talked about this, just repeat something that we shared. Shanta is neutrality, Shanta rasa or Shanta rati. So what we heard is that those yogis who fix their mind on Paramatma with a tinge of bhakti, that's called Dhyan Yoga, then the perfection of such a person is to attain Shanta Rasa. They attain a position in the spiritual world that's neutrality. However, if that person has association with devotees who are engaged in practical activity, they can also achieve Dasya Rasa and further other developments of their relationship with the personality of Godhead besides meditation on Paramatma. Make offerings with love and devotion, depending according to different moods of love, and so forth. Mm-hmm. There's a nice verse in the 12th chapter. This is chapter 14. And in the 12th chapter, Brahma comes to visit, to pay his respects to Krishna in Vrindavan. And what he sees is the cowherd boys playing. And Shukadeva Goswami is narrating all this. And he goes, wow, these cowherd boys, they're so elevated. The Gyanis, they spend lifetimes trying to fix their mind on Brahma Sukh, the happiness of Brahman. The yogis, by their process of meditation, for lifetimes, by their meditation, cannot even touch a particle of dust from the lotus feet of Krishna. And even those engaged in Dasya Bhakti, They see the Supreme Lord as their worshipable master, but these cowherd boys, they're playing with him. They're frolicking with him. They're rolling on the ground with him. They're wrestling with him. They're playing leapfrog with him. When they play games, one of the games is the cowherd boys, they have lunches sent from their mothers. So one of the cowherd boys snatches the lunch from one of the other boys. And the boy that had lunch stolen from him, he goes running after it, and they throw the lunch to somebody else, and he goes running to somebody else, and they throw the lunch to some. That's instead of making offerings with regulative principles as we do, the cowherd boys, they're just playing. With the same person, the Supreme Person, because of the intimacy of their love with him. Who can say how many krita, punya, punja, how many pious activities they perform to have that kind of intimate relationship? And then Shukadev goes on to say, not just them, everybody in Vrindavan, they're with Krishna all the time. The cowherd boys especially, they're with him all day long. The elders, they're back home. Oh, is he okay? The gopis are going mad. When is he coming back? They're just playing. So, very elevated position, in other words. But from our position, the process of offering the paraphernalia of this universe in a suitable way as an offering of love and devotion to the Supreme Lord, that's beyond liberation. Liberation is identifying with who you really are, as spirit as opposed to matter. Beyond that kind of liberation is the practical activity of gauging paraphernalia of the Lord. This universe is paraphernalia of the Lord in his service. It's a whole other consciousness, and we're far from it because we're conditioned souls thinking, I want to get some enjoyment here. A very nice definition, just read it before coming, from Jiva Goswami and his son Darvas. It connects with this Brahmabhuta. This is a prelude to Saturday evening's discussion, by the way. Where one's happiness, you say it positively and then negatively, where one's happiness is exclusively, this is love, by the way, where the happiness of the beloved, Krishna, is exclusively the source of one's own happiness. That's beyond liberation. And then the negative is whatever obstacle or difficulty one may find that's standing in the way of pleasing Krishna. The reference is made to Queen Kunti. She prays, please remove these obstacles so I can think of you. Not like, there's somebody that's not treating me nicely, could you please remove them? Not like that. My mind should go entirely, exclusively to pleasing you. That's what I want. And this distraction, it's internal. Please remove that internal distraction. And in her case with Queen Kunti, it's her affection for both her father's family and her own children family. So, we'll hear some more. Let's see if there's some discussion. Liberation and bondage for the devotee are insignificant. 7:15. Okay. You were taking some notes.
Yeah, Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaj. I have a couple of other questions than Brahma and his prayers.
That's okay.
But since we had this discussion, I have one curious question to ask on the same lesson.
Okay.
So, how do I differentiate Yog Maya and a person's material intelligence or the limitations on? So, like Brahma could not, realize that he's Supreme Personality of Godhead.
He did realize.
Okay.
He did realize he's the personality of Godhead. He didn't realize the kind of love that the residents of Vrindavan have for him. He knew he was the personality of Godhead.
Hmm. So it's not called Yoga Maya, or
It was Yogamaya.
It was okay.
It was Yogamaya.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
So yes, I was wondering that Brahma was under the Yoga Maya and he could not realize, or was it
Yes.
that his personal limitation on not knowing him as Supreme Personality?
He knew him as the Supreme Personality.
Mm-hmm.
But the mistake that he made, it was an offense. It wasn't just like, I slipped on a banana peel. It wasn't that kind of inattentive kind of mistake.
Mm-hmm.
It was offensive in two ways. One, he challenged his mystic power against Krishna's mystic power. What are you going to do? That's not.
So then, is that his limitation on? So how could
It wasn't
he do
Mahamaya.
that? Okay.
It wasn't Mahamaya. It was his curiosity misapplied.
Oh, okay.
Krishna orchestrated that for multiple reasons. One of them was so that for a whole year, Krishna could be a cowherd boy and a calf for all of the mothers and the cows that wanted Krishna to be their son and their calf.
Right.
So he assisted Brahma to do what Brahma did by inspiring him from within. Because Brahma is not an ordinary person.
Right.
He's conducted by Yogamaya potency.
Got it. Yeah.
All right?
Yeah. Thanks on that. And another question is now getting related to the the discussion that we had about Bhakti Yoga, and then I'm going back to Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga since I'm reading more on Bhakti on Bhagavad Gita.
Okay.
So the first question actually I had is was Arjuna was a great Karma Yogi? Can I say this?
No. I mean,
okay.
He's a great bhakta, and bhaktas are the best of the karma yogis.
Correct.
I mean, in karma yoga, in the sense of dedication of their activity to Krishna.
Correct.
Not being attached to the results, but dedicating the results to Krishna.
Right.
That's a karma yogi.
So in the whole Bhagavad Gita, what we see is though Krishna is telling the importance of karma yoga, jnana yoga, dhyana, everything, and then he comes to bhakti yoga and showing, and I guess the third or fourth chapter where Arjuna asks that I can quit because why do I have to do these karmas and duties and follow this dharma being a kshatriya instead of fighting? Can I just he had that in his mind, and then later on he made sure that he follows his duties, and he finished the war, right? He fights
because
against.
it was for Krishna. That's the
Right.
reason.
So he is a bhakta, but he wanted to fulfill all the duties that he as a to follow the dharma.
A devotee follows dharma. A devotee doesn't say, "Hey, I'm a devotee. I don't have to follow dharma."
Right.
A devotee is concerned. You and I and each of us should be concerned. What is my duty in this situation?
Right.
Now, a guiding principle in understanding what his duty is, what's pleasing to Krishna. That's bhakti. And karma yoga is, karma is not just work, it's prescribed duties for me, given my psychophysical nature and so forth. What's my duty? I mean, your duty as a housewife or mother, and you have various duties that you do. So you have duties. Now, not doing them is vikarma, doing them is karma, and doing them for Krishna is akarma. So that's the bhakti principle. So he was the best of karma yogis. So that is to say, all those, when you have $1 million, you have $10 and $100. So the karma yoga, jnana yoga, the other processes are subsets of the bhakti process. They're within the bhakti process. So Krishna can speak about a principle of karma yoga, or Krishna can speak a principle about jnana yoga or dhyana yoga, and they're subsets of the bhakti process. They have the methodology may not look the same, but the principle is the same. Detachment from the fruits of your work, but working as you're obligated. You know the verse. Karma nevadikaraste ma paleshu kadashan. Everybody knows the verse.
Right.
So, Arjun, karma yoga topic. You're entitled to do your duty. You're not entitled to the results. So that's a subset of bhakti. That's already included in bhakti. $10 is already there in $1 million.
Right.
Okay?
So then coming back to the discussion that we had now, when you're saying the ignorance has two parts, right? One is the material bondage and other one is liberation, which is again materially escaping from the sufferings.
Negation of.
Right. So coming, to the karma yoga part where, me, what I'm kind of seeing is, follow your duties and make Krishna as a center.
Yes.
So with this, I'm still ignorant, or because I'm still following the karma, I'm still following the material.
It's by following, because I'm still following. Following is not stopped.
It's a process.
It's the consciousness behind the following. No, I'm doing because I don't want bondage. I'm following because I don't want sinful reaction by neglect of my duties.
Got it.
And I want, the good reaction, the consequences by doing my duties nicely. I'll prosper and be happy and go to heaven and, nice things.
Got it.
So that's Sakama Karma Yoga.
Correct.
And then there's Nishkam Karma Yoga, and then beyond that is Bhakti. So you're not in the wrong mindset or orientation by carefully considering what are my duties in this lifetime, in this circumstance and so forth. Then we still consider duties. But the essence of making the alignment of that duty for the ultimate purpose, Krishna is to be pleased.
Right.
And that drives the aligning process, and it drives this clarity as to what duties are in this circumstance or that circumstance. And that was Arjun's problem. His bhakti had been camouflaged, or
right.
apparently not there, because he's a pure devotee. So because the bhakti was missing, he was confused about duty, and he was using virtuous reasons why he shouldn't be on the battlefield.
Right.
And they sounded like good reasons until Krishna said, Arjuna.
True.
Okay?
Sure. Thanks, Guru Maharaj.
Okay. You go ahead.
Hare Krishna Maharaj. My question is, liberation is basically not in stages. It's
not what?
It's not in stages. There is nothing as liberation. Once you understand that you're the soul, like you said, the sun always sees sunlight. So there is
there's
nothing.
not darkness at night.
Right. So there is no concept as liberation once you understand the soul. Do I understand that correct?
Understand theoretically and realize are two different things. But once the consciousness, not just, hey, I agree, I checked the box, I'm spirit soul, I'm liberated. But when consciousness is, situated properly, there is no liberation, there's no bondage. It's consciousness, spiritual consciousness. So does that answer your question? Okay.
And just one more, Maharaj. So is samadhi, samadhi,
Yes.
they take samadhi. So is that real, and is that,
Yes.
and then is that something that does connect to the Paramatma then?
Oh, yeah. Yes. There are stages of samadhi, by the way. There's this samadhi of the Paramatma meditator. And then there's stages of samadhi beyond the Paramatma meditator. And if you, it's a really nice section, chapter 3, verses 21 through 23, something like that. Can you look it up on your phone? Huh? 6 chapter, verses 21 through 23, I think. It's just a definition of samadhi. And Prabhupada's purport is beautiful. Because it says, by chanting Hare Krishna, the stage of nirvana is surpassed. I mean, it goes a little slower than that, but nirvana is a Sanskrit word that the Buddhists use, and it means cessation of material existence. And beyond the cessation of material existence, that's this liberation, cessation of material existence, nirvana, or Brahma-bhuta. This positive, I'm spirit soul, I'm not the body. Beyond the conception of bodily existence, there's, what do? Well, if you're a Buddhist, you don't do anything. You do nothing. You enter into this condition of void. There's like very technical Sanskrit terminology for all of it. But you don't even exist. So what to speak of do anything? But the bhakti principle is that's where life begins. Muktir hitvanyata rupam svarupena yavastati. That's taken from the Bhagavatam. It's right in that purport. Where svarupa, your own spiritual form, you engage in activity in your spiritual form. That's beyond liberation. Beyond the nirvana kind of liberation. And then there's joy. The joy of ceasing to exist isn't really so joyful. The misery portion may temporarily be anesthetized, but the spiritual activity, joy, is missing. So that's the further stage of samadhi discussed in that purport. Did you find it? 20 to 23. 6:20 to 23. And you'll find what I just said right in the purport. Okay? Anything, you guys? No? Okay. Back in the back. Very interesting sound. $7:30.
Hare Krishna Guru Maharaj. I was thinking about all these terms. So, Sthita Prajna, then Brahma Bhuta Prasanatma. Now, another new term, Ridgya Bhavat. Am I right?
Which one?
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry, I'm unable to pronounce.
Ritagya Bhava. Go ahead.
Bhavat. So I'm trying to contrast these, like trying to understand these.
The language that
Yeah.
this means this and that means that.
Yeah, just so Sthita Prajna stage is a person is liberated. He knows who he is. He's self-realized.
Steady intelligence. That's very simple. Sthita pragya.
Okay. He's self-realized, but there is ignorance about who God is.
Well, it depends. You could have a sthita. Was Vyasadeva sthita pragya? Did he know about Krishna? Yeah. So it can be lesser and more complete and more complete. Okay?
Okay. So I was trying, there is no bhakti component in the Sthita Prajna stage, correct?
It depends.
Okay.
Your same question, you're just asking it in the back door.
Okay.
Same question.
Okay.
A pure devotee can be Sthita Prajna, and then there's certainly consciousness of the Supreme. But the way that it's used in Bhagavad Gita has to do with the Jnani, whose intelligence is very strong and steady, and for that reason, they're neither hankering or lamenting. They're neutral towards duality because they're fixed in transcendence. That's limited, and then it can mature. Okay. Okay. Who's doing the online questions?
Okay. This is from Shashi Rekha Devidasi. So, Maharaj, in my understanding, bhakta can be jnani or may not be jnani, but jnani cannot be bhakta always.
Well, that's an interesting way to say it. The devotee, a bhakta, is not a jnani. A bhakta, a devotee, will also have knowledge, but it's not the jnani flavor. It's knowledge that Krishna awakens from within the heart, like Vasudeve Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Prayojataha Janayati Ashu Vairagyam Jnana Cha Yadahaitukam. So knowledge awakens in the heart of a devotee prompted by Krishna, and that's a very different flavor or experience or mood than the jnani who is using his empirical powers to try to understand transcendence, like someone using a flashlight looking for the sun. That's not how you find the sun. Sun is self-luminous, and the sun will show itself. So the jnani doesn't want to use that self-luminous process, the descending process. They want to use the ascending process. So the jnani is not what a devotee does. And jnane prayasa udapasya namanta eva. That's this Brahma's prayer. Verse number 3. The devotee discards the jnana process. They get knowledge. We read Bhagavad Gita. We read Srimad Bhagavatam. We read transcendental literature. But we're not using the faculty of jnana to understand it. We're using the faculty of bhakti to try to understand it by descending knowledge to illumine the heart. I think that answers your question, I hope. Let's see.
The next one is from Sanchari.
Okay.
In the spiritual form of a soul already set, meaning when they fell, that was their position, and then when the soul returns, they resume that position to serve Krishna. I'm trying to understand the Shanta Rasa devotees who go back to the spiritual world. Do they assume their original position, or do they go through sincere desire and exposure to devotional service? Do they have the higher opportunity to move towards a higher rasa?
Well, the question is kind of all over the place, but just to keep it simple, yes, we have a natural rasa that eternally exists, whether it's Shanta or anything. And yes, this is Prabhupada answering Tamal Krishna Maharaj. In the spiritual world, is it possible for souls to move from one rasa to another? And Prabhupada said, yes, in the spiritual world things are not static, they're dynamic. But what that process is and what it looks like, and what it feels like, and all of those things, Prabhupada didn't elaborate. It's just describing a principle. So specific to the Shanta, I mentioned already, one may be in Shanta, one may be a yogi meditating on Paramatma with some devotion towards that Paramatma, and that yogi may have the association of someone who's in, Sakiras, and they may become inspired by that association and move in that direction. But how that's a little elevated subject. I think for now we should be worried about connecting to Krishna and detaching from matter. But the principle is dynamic. It's the rasas can be fluid.
She has another question.
Oh boy.
What is the difference between a Shanta Rasa devotee and a yogi who wants to attain transcendence?
The yogi that wants to attain transcendence may or may not have bhakti. And if that yogi wishing to achieve transcendence has some bhakti, not just like I want out of this crazy place, I want liberation. If there's some bhakti, then that's Shanta Rasa, Shanta Rati. And without it, it's just it's the negation part. Okay?
This is from Uttama Bhakta Das, part 2 from this morning. My understanding is that impersonalism evolved in Kali Yuga by the advent of Lord Buddha onto Shankaracharya and so on. How and in what form did it exist in previous yugas, especially in Satya Yuga?
Well, this is my understanding. They popularized something, but it was pre-existing. And what the form of it could have been, might have been, or was, probably underwent transformations and permutations and combinations. It's just, according to a particular culture and a particular time and a particular circumstance, it's going to take this shape, that shape. And they promoted it in a certain way, according to time, place, and circumstance. So the name under which it went and how it looked and those kinds of things, I can't say.
One more question from Shashi Rekha Devidasi, related to Mataji's question. I think Gayatri Mataji's question. Does it mean that most yogis are sthita prajna?
Most yogis are sthita prajna. Well, perfected yogis are, and most yogis are not perfected yogis. That's it. Okay. Last chance. Okay. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.